In the basement of the city library, where dust floated like lazy ghosts in the shafted light, Elara Voss moved quietly between leaning stacks of forgotten books. She had always preferred this part of the building, a neglected archive of faded covers and brittle pages that no one else bothered to touch. The hum of the heating system above was faint here, muffled by decades of neglect. Her fingers traced over cracked leather bindings and warped cardboard spines until they paused on something out of place. It was a children's book, thin and faded, its once bright cover illustration dulled to a watercolor blur. The title, The Adventures of Little Sunbird, was printed in cheerful curling letters, the kind you'd expect in a nursery, not here among the relics of academic treatises and forgotten encyclopedias. She pulled it free and frowned. It was heavier than it should have been, and the pages were warped, as if they'd been damp at some point. She carried it to the lone table under a flickering bulb, brushing dust from the cover. The first pages seemed ordinary enough, watercolor drawings of jungle animals, smiling children, and bright tropical skies. But then, in the margins of page 7, she noticed something peculiar. Small, deliberate markings in pencil. Not doodles, not the clumsy shapes of a child's hand. These were neat, precise, angular. She leaned closer. Each tiny shape was made of dots, curves, and strokes that didn't match any modern language she recognized. Yet something about them stirred a memory from her graduate days. The late-night readings on ancient civilizations. The endless tables of symbols she'd once memorized for exams. She felt her pulse quicken. Flipping further, she found more of the same markings scattered throughout the book, sometimes in the top corner, sometimes hidden in the curve of a drawn tree trunk, once cleverly worked into the pattern on a bird's feathers. She turned the pages carefully, noting that the symbols followed no obvious pattern, but were clearly intentional. Elara reached for her phone, opened the photo app, and began taking careful shots of each page containing a mark. With every new one she discovered, the weight in her chest grew heavier. She couldn't yet name the symbols, but deep down she knew they weren't the idle marks of some bored librarian. They were a message. She sat back, the book open in front of her, the humming light above casting long shadows across the page. The air seemed to thicken, the silence pressing in. Somewhere above, life went on. Footsteps on polished floors, quiet conversations, the creak of the front door. But here, in this forgotten corner, she felt as though she'd stepped out of time. Her mind returned to a single memory. A guest lecture during her internship at the university archives, where an eccentric anthropologist had rolled out photographs of Mayan glyphs. He'd described them as stories carved into time itself, each shape carrying layers of meaning. Sounds, words, entire histories embedded in a single form. Elara remembered the intricate curves, the dot and bar numerals, the almost whimsical yet deadly precise designs. And now, looking at these faint pencil markings in a children's book, she realized with a slow, unsteady breath that they were nearly identical. It made no sense. These symbols belonged to a civilization thousands of years and thousands of miles removed from this book's probable origin. What were they doing here, hidden among smiling cartoon monkeys and bright parrots? She traced one with her fingertip, feeling the faint indentation the pencil had left. Whoever had made these marks had done so with care. This wasn't vandalism. This was preservation. The thought brought with it a rush of questions. Who had owned this book before it ended up here? Had they known what the symbols meant? Was this some kind of code, a puzzle left for someone who could recognize it? And The most unsettling question, why hide it at all? Her watch beeped faintly, telling her the library was closing soon. But she didn't want to leave. She had the uneasy sense that once she stepped out of this basement, the fragile magic of the discovery might evaporate. She packed the book gently into her satchel, ignoring the internal voice that warned her this might break some library rule. For now, rules didn't matter. The symbols were too strange, too compelling to leave behind. As she climbed the narrow basement stairs, she cast one last glance over her shoulder at the shadowed shelves. The dust motes still drifted, untouched by the air from above. She didn't know it yet, but in her hands she was carrying the first thread of a mystery that would unravel the boundaries between the known and the impossible. Somewhere, hidden deep in the story of Little Sunbird, a civilization's voice was whispering through the centuries, and Elara Voss had just started listening. Elara spent that night hunched over her kitchen table, the children's book open beneath the glow of a single lamp. The rain outside tapped steadily against the window, a sound she barely registered as she compared the photographs she'd taken to the online archives of Mayan glyphs. At first, she told herself it was just curiosity, a librarian's compulsion to identify the unknown. But within minutes, the feeling shifted. It was no longer idle interest. It was recognition. The first symbol she examined matched a known glyph for keen, meaning sun or day. The second looked like the glyph for Chak, the god of rain and storms. The combination was odd, but it was undeniably authentic. She leaned closer, scrolling through the digital database, her heart thudding. Every new mark she checked had a direct counterpart in the catalogue of ancient Mayan writing. This made no logical sense. The Mayan civilization had flourished in Mesoamerica over 1,000 years ago. Their written language was preserved in carved stone, painted pottery, and rare bark paper codices, not in the pencil margins of a mid-20th century children's book. She pushed the book away for a moment and rubbed her eyes. Maybe she was making a connection where none existed. Maybe the resemblance was a coincidence. But when she flipped to a page depicting a parrot perched on a tree branch, she froze. The glyph on that page was not just a word, it was a name. Bak Nal Tun, a title referring to a place. The Fortress of the Stone Sun. Her mind spun. If these glyphs spelled out actual words, names, places, then this wasn't random. This was a message. Elara reached for a notebook and began copying them down in order. She numbered each, sketching their forms as accurately as she could. Soon, a pattern emerged. The glyphs weren't scattered without purpose. They followed a sequence, flowing through the book like an invisible second story beneath the illustrated one. She translated what she could, piecing together fragments. Sun rises, fortress waits, path hidden, storm comes. It was incomplete, but the cadence of it felt deliberate, almost poetic. Her mind flashed back to her graduate studies, to the one course where they'd discussed the survival of indigenous knowledge through covert means. Scholars had speculated that during colonial suppression, certain scribes disguised sacred texts within seemingly harmless materials, prayer books, letters, even children's primers. Could the adventures of Little Sunbird be one of those vessels, a modern echo of an ancient strategy? If so, why this book? And why now? She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the hands that had drawn these glyphs. Perhaps an aging archaeologist who feared his work would be stolen or destroyed. Perhaps a Mayan descendant passing down a guarded truth to a chosen heir. Whoever it was, they had chosen a vessel so unassuming that it had sat untouched in a library basement for decades until today. But another thought intruded, colder than the rain outside. If the code had been hidden so carefully, maybe it was meant to stay hidden. She shook off the unease and leaned forward again, determined to finish what she had started. Hours passed as she worked, her translations forming a loose narrative that hinted at a location. One particular sequence repeated, glyphs for gold, temple, and sun, always in that order. The repetition felt like emphasis, as if the writer wanted to burn it into the reader's mind. And then she found the one that made her stop breathing for a moment. A glyph, meaning pyramid, paired with the word for hidden, and a numerical notation that could only be a date. She scribbled the details into her notebook, her hands trembling. It wasn't a clear map, not yet, but the implication was staggering. If the code was authentic, it could be pointing toward an undiscovered Mayan site, one possibly made of gold. Elara sat back, staring at the open book. The rain had stopped, and silence pressed in. Her gaze shifted to the small clock on the wall, 3:17 a.m. She hadn't eaten, hadn't moved except to flip pages. The rational part of her mind told her to sleep, to leave it until morning, but she couldn't. Somewhere in these pages was the key to something that had been buried for centuries, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt certain that she had been meant to find it. Outside, the first pale light of dawn touched the wet streets. Inside, Elara turned another page, and the ancient symbols seemed to lean toward her, waiting. By the third day, Elara's apartment looked less like a home and more like an excavation site. Pages from the children's book were photocopied and taped to her walls, each one connected by lengths of coloured string to notes, sketches, and printouts of Mayan glyph charts. Coffee cups littered the kitchen counter, and a pile of unopened mail gathered dust by the door. Her entire world had collapsed into two realities, the one where she went to her job at the library, and the one where she lived inside the code. The breakthrough came in the early afternoon, while she was tracing a line of glyphs from page 23 onto her notepad. She noticed something she'd overlooked. The illustrations in the book weren't just generic jungle scenes. Each one contained subtle landmarks, the curve of a mountain ridge, the angle of a river bend, the silhouette of a stepped pyramid faintly tucked into the background. She laid out the pages in sequence, ignoring the printed text of the children's story. The plot of The Adventures of Little Sunbird, a bird travelling through the jungle meeting animal friends, was nothing more than a smokescreen. Beneath it, the images and glyphs together formed a coherent journey, one that pointed toward a specific destination. Her fingers trembled as she followed the path on paper. It began at a coastal inlet, wound through a river valley, skirted a volcano, and ended at a glyph for pyramid positioned at the mouth of a canyon. Next to it, a series of numbers, not Mayan this time, but modern coordinates, were subtly woven into the design of a tree trunk. She entered the numbers into her laptop, her heart thudding against her ribs. The map loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, until the image resolved into a dense swath of green. The coordinates pointed to an uninhabited stretch of Guatemalan rainforest, miles from any recorded archaeological site. Elara zoomed in. The satellite imagery showed only a blur of foliage. No clearings, no ruins, no hint of human presence. It was perfect. A thrill shot through her, followed quickly by a knot of apprehension. If this was real, then the secrecy made sense. Remote jungle sites were often stripped by looters within days of discovery. And if the legends of a golden pyramid were even partially true, it would be the most coveted archaeological prize of the century. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the green square on the screen. There was more to the glyphs than just a route. There were warnings embedded in the text. Words like storm, curse, and trial appeared in key places. She tried to tell herself it was just poetic flourish, a traditional way to mark sacred sites. But there was a weight in the phrasing, a sense of something deliberately ominous. For the first time since finding the book, Elara hesitated. Her rational mind whispered that she should contact a university or the local heritage authorities. Let them handle it. But another part of her, the part that had spent years quietly archiving other people's discoveries, never making one of her own, burned at the thought of handing it over. The glyph for pyramid seemed to stare at her from the page, daring her to see it through. By evening, she had made her choice. She began pulling out her old hiking pack, laying in supplies. Her savings account would take a hit, but she could manage a flight to Guatemala City. From there, she'd have to find someone willing to guide her into the jungle. As she zipped the pack shut, a small thought whispered in the back of her mind, one she quickly pushed away. If the code had remained hidden for this long, maybe it wasn't because no one had found it. Maybe it was because those who had never came back. Elara hadn't told anyone the real reason for her trip. To her colleagues at the library, she was taking a much-needed vacation. To her sister, she was going on a photography tour. The truth, that she was chasing an ancient code hidden in a children's book, would have sounded absurd even to herself a month ago. The first leg of the journey went smoothly enough. A flight into Guatemala City, a night in a small hotel near the historic center, and then the slow work of finding someone who would take her deep into the jungle. Most guides she approached shook their heads immediately when she showed them the map coordinates. One man actually laughed, muttering something about ghost lands and walking away without another word. By the third day, she found him. Mateo, a wiry man in his 40s with sun-darkened skin and sharp, assessing eyes. He listened without interrupting as she explained her interest in a historical site near the Sierra de las Minas. She did not mention the Golden Pyramid. "That's no tourist trail," he said finally. "It's government-restricted land, no villages, no roads, only rivers and canopy." "I don't need a road," Elara replied. "I need someone who can get me there." He studied her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "I'll take you," he said, "but only because I'm curious why a quiet woman from another country would risk her life for a place that locals avoid." They set out 2 days later with minimal supplies: hammocks, mosquito nets, machetes, water filters. The air in the jungle was thick enough to drink, the kind of heat that pressed into your lungs and slowed your steps. Every few hours they paused to drink and check their bearings. Mateo led without hesitation, following rivers and narrow animal trails invisible to Elara's untrained eyes. At night, they camped beneath the dense canopy. The jungle never truly slept. The air pulsed with the chirps of insects, the distant calls of howler monkeys, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the undergrowth. Elara lay in her hammock, staring at the faint outline of leaves overhead, replaying the glyphs in her mind. On the fourth night, as they sat by a small fire, Mateo finally asked, "What is it you're looking for?" She hesitated. The firelight flickered across his face, making his eyes look darker, unreadable. "A ruin," she said carefully. "Something that's been lost for a long time." His gaze lingered on her, and she sensed he didn't fully believe her, but he didn't press. "Some places are lost for a reason," he said quietly, then tossed another stick into the flames. By the 7th day, the jungle changed. The air grew cooler, the ground steeper, the trees older and thicker. They began following a narrow gorge, its walls rising high on either side. Matteo slowed often, scanning the terrain with an alertness that made Elara's skin prickle. It was then she saw it. Faint but deliberate carvings in the stone of the gorge wall. Not random scratches, but symbols. Her heart pounded as she ran her fingers over them. The shapes were nearly identical to the glyphs from the children's book. "They mark the way," she murmured. Matteo glanced at her sharply. "You can read them?" "Some," she admitted. "Enough to know we're close." The path narrowed further, forcing them to move single file along a ledge barely wider than a man's shoulders. Below, the river churned in white froth. Above, the gorge walls leaned inward, dimming the light. When they finally emerged into an open space, Elara felt her breath catch. Ahead, the jungle seemed to fold around a hidden valley, its floor lost in shadow. And in the distance, barely visible through the curtain of vines and mist, was a glint of something unnatural, something that caught the dying light of the sun and held it. It was only there for a moment before the mist closed in again, but Elara knew what she had seen. They were close enough to touch history. And whatever lay ahead was either the culmination of her search or the start of something far darker than she could imagine. At dawn, the mist in the hidden valley clung low to the ground, shifting in slow, ghostly ribbons. Elara stood at the edge of the overlook, the damp air beading on her skin, her heart thudding in a steady, unnatural rhythm. She could see it now, the faint shape beneath the blanket of jungle growth, a geometry too precise to be natural. Even shrouded in vines, it rose with the unmistakable symmetry of a pyramid. Matteo stood beside her, his face unreadable. "You understand," he said quietly, "that if this is real, you may not be the first to find it." Others might have reached it and never returned. Elara didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on a single strip of sunlight cutting through the canopy and striking what looked like a polished surface near the pyramid's peak. It shone briefly, like a golden flare, then vanished as the sun shifted. The book's warnings came back to her in fragments. Storm comes. Path hidden. Trial. The descent into the valley was brutal. Roots tangled their feet, moss-covered stones shifted under their weight, and the air thickened with the scent of damp earth and decay. Twice, Matteo halted suddenly, crouching to examine the ground. "Old steps," he murmured the second time, brushing away soil to reveal cut stone. "Centuries old. Someone carved these into the slope." It was early afternoon when they reached the base. Up close, the pyramid was both magnificent and unsettling. Its sides were nearly swallowed by vegetation, yet the angles remained sharp, defiant against the jungle's slow reclamation. Massive stone blocks, weathered but intact, formed tiered steps leading to the summit. And here and there, patches of something metallic gleamed faintly beneath the moss, as if gold itself had been laid into the stone. Elara reached out, pressing her palm to one of the blocks. The stone was cool, almost too cool for the heat of the day. Her fingers traced a shallow carving, a glyph nearly identical to the ones in the book. This one was paired with another, a warning glyph she hadn't been able to fully translate. Matteo's voice was low. "We shouldn't linger here. The forest around places like this, it listens." They climbed cautiously, each step deliberate, until they reached a broad platform halfway up. From here, the jungle spread in every direction, unbroken except for the jagged shadow of the gorge they'd passed through. In the center of the platform, a narrow stone doorway yawned open, its lintel carved with more glyphs. Elara pulled her notebook from her pack, flipping to the copied sequence from the book. The match was perfect. "This is it," she whispered. The entrance. Matteo lit a small torch, the flames sputtering in the heavy air. The light revealed a tunnel sloping downward, the walls close enough to brush with both hands. The floor was slick with moisture, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, water dripped in slow, irregular beats. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing faintly. The glyphs continued along the walls, now joined by bas-relief carvings, scenes of figures carrying offerings, kneeling before a great stepped temple, and others fleeing beneath darkened skies. Ilara's pulse quickened as she recognized one repeating symbol, the pyramid, encircled by what appeared to be stylized flames. "Trial," she murmured to herself. The tunnel ended abruptly in a small chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness. At the far wall stood an altar of polished stone, and on it rested a single object, a small golden idol shaped like a stylized sun. Even in the dim torchlight, it radiated a warm glow. Elara stepped forward, almost against her will. She could feel the pull of it, not greed, but something older, deeper, like the weight of a promise made centuries ago. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the metal. A sharp crack split the silence. Stone grated against stone beneath their feet. Matteo's torch wavered as the floor began to tremble. Somewhere deep in the pyramid, something had been triggered. Ilara's breath caught. The trial had begun. The vibration deepened into a low, resonant growl that seemed to come from the bones of the pyramid itself. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the torchlight flickered violently. Elara jerked her hand back from the golden idol, but it was too late. The chamber had already awakened. Matteo's voice cut through the rising noise. "We have to move, now!" The floor beneath the altar shifted with a grinding groan, and a series of stone slabs began retracting into the walls, revealing dark, gaping channels on either side of the chamber. A sudden gust of air surged through them, not cool, but warm, carrying the scent of something metallic and sharp. Ilara's mind snapped back to one of the warning glyphs she hadn't been able to fully translate, the one paired with the symbol for pyramid, the breath of the gods. Before she could process the meaning, there was a hiss, and twin jets of pressurized air shot from the openings, slamming against the walls opposite. The force was enough to make the torch flame whip sideways, nearly extinguishing it. Matteo grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the tunnel they had entered through, but as they reached it, another grinding sound came, the floor stones shifting beneath their feet. "The steps!" Matteo shouted, and they both jumped to the narrow edge of the passage, just as a section of the floor dropped away entirely, revealing a pit beneath, its bottom invisible in the gloom. Ilara's heartbeat pounded in her ears. "It's a trap," she gasped. Matteo gave her a grim look. "No, it's a test." The words struck her harder than the rush of adrenaline already flooding her veins. The book's cryptic lines replayed in her mind. Path hidden. Trial. Storm comes. This wasn't just meant to protect the pyramid from looters. It was built to force anyone who entered to prove something. But what? They navigated the edge of the passage, hugging the wall as more sections of the floor slid away, the grinding echoing deep into the pyramid's heart. When they finally reached the slope leading upward to the doorway, Elara risked a glance back. The golden idol still sat on the altar, untouched, gleaming faintly through the dust. She thought of grabbing it, of claiming it as proof of their discovery, but something in her gut screamed against it. The glyphs had told a story, and that story hadn't been about treasure. It had been about a warning. Once outside on the platform, they both bent over, gasping for breath in the heavy jungle air. Matteo's knuckles were white on the torch handle. "We can't stay here," he said. "If this place is what I think it is, it's meant to close itself again, and maybe not let anyone back out." They descended the pyramid quickly, the gold inlaid into the stone catching faint glimmers of light as though mocking them with what they were leaving behind. At the base, Elara turned back, her eyes scanning the hidden carvings. One in particular caught her attention, a depiction of the pyramid with the sun above it, surrounded by 4 smaller figures. In their hands, they carried not gold, but scrolls. "It's knowledge," she murmured. "Not gold. That's what this place protects." Matteo followed her gaze. "And knowledge can be more dangerous than gold," he said softly. They moved into the jungle, retracing their steps toward the gorge. But with every mile they put between themselves and the pyramid, Elara felt the weight of something unspoken pressing heavier on her chest. She had seen enough of the glyphs to know that the storm they mentioned was not a metaphor. Something was coming, and now she was one of the very few who knew it. By the time they reached the gorge, the jungle had grown eerily silent. The constant insect chorus was gone, replaced by a faint, low hum that Elara couldn't quite place. The air felt heavier, charged in a way that prickled her skin. Matteo stopped at the narrow ledge where they had first entered the valley. He crouched low, scanning the tree line behind them. "We're being followed," he said flatly. Elara's stomach tightened. "Who?" "Not animals," he replied. "People." Her mind leapt to the worst possibility. Looters. If word of the pyramid had somehow leaked, it wouldn't take much to draw the kind of men who stripped sacred sites bare for profit. But they hadn't told anyone. The only connection between the book and the site was her. Unless someone else had known the code was there all along. They pressed on, moving faster along the narrow trail. At the far end of the gorge, the path sloped upward, leading them back toward higher ground. Every so often, Matteo glanced over his shoulder. Once, Elara thought she caught a flicker of movement in the trees, a shadow where none should be. By dusk, they reached a small rise overlooking the jungle. Matteo lit no fire that night. They ate cold rations in silence, listening. Twice, Elara thought she heard the soft crunch of footsteps in the undergrowth. The second time, she caught Matteo's eye, and he gave a small shake of his head, a silent warning to stay quiet. In the early hours before dawn, the hum in the air intensified, accompanied by the distant rumble of thunder. A thin line of orange split the horizon, not the soft light of sunrise, but something sharper, almost unnatural. The glyphs came back to her in an unbroken sequence now. Storm comes, fortress waits, path hidden. "What if the storm isn't weather?" she whispered. Matteo looked at her, his expression unreadable.
"Then it's already here." They broke camp quickly, pushing hard through the morning heat until the jungle began to thin. But just as they crested a low ridge, Elara froze. Below them, in a clearing at the forest's edge, were 3 men. They were dressed in mismatched gear, cargo pants, weather-stained shirts, and carried rifles slung over their shoulders. One of them had a pack that looked suspiciously like a satellite communicator. "Looters," Matteo murmured, confirming her fear. "They're heading toward the gorge." Elara's mind raced. If they reached the pyramid, they might survive the traps, or worse, they might not care about the cost. Either way, the site would be exposed. Matteo touched her arm. We could warn them, or we could make sure they never find it. The choice hung between them like the oppressive heat.
Elara thought of the golden idol, of the scrolls depicted in the carvings, of the strange hum in the air. If the pyramid truly guarded knowledge that could be dangerous in the wrong hands, she couldn't let these men near it. She met Matteo's eyes. We turn them back. They moved quickly and quietly, circling to intercept the looters before they reached the gorge. Elara's pulse roared in her ears, but a strange calm settled over her. She had come here chasing a mystery. Now she understood she was also its protector. Somewhere behind them, hidden beneath layers of stone and centuries of secrecy, the golden pyramid waited. And above it, the storm, whatever it truly was, drew closer. They caught up to the looters just as the men reached the first bend in the gorge. The air was thick with humidity, the jungle canopy overhead filtering the morning light into a dim green haze. Matteo moved ahead, stepping into the path with deliberate ease, his machete visible at his side, but not raised. The leader of the three men, a broad-shouldered figure with a week's worth of stubble, stopped short, hand hovering near his rifle. Trails closed ahead, Matteo said evenly, voice carrying just enough steel to make the point. The man's eyes narrowed. Closed by who? Elara stepped into view behind Matteo, her heart pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. By the people who know what's in there, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. For a moment, no one spoke. The leader's gaze swept over her, calculating, assessing. And what exactly is in there? He asked, his tone mocking. Elara held his stare. Something you don't want to meet. One of the other men muttered something in Spanish, unease creeping into his voice. The leader barked at him to shut up, but Elara saw the flicker of doubt pass through all three. She stepped forward. You walk into that gorge, you won't come back out. That's not a threat. That's a promise from the people who built what's inside. Matteo's expression didn't change, but she felt his approval in the way he didn't interrupt. The leader shifted his stance, trying to mask the unease spreading among his crew. We'll find our own way, he said. But there was less certainty in his tone now. Elara leaned in slightly. You'll find a tomb. Yours. The words landed like a weight. After a tense moment, the leader gestured to his men, and they stepped back, muttering under their breath. Without another word, the trio turned and disappeared into the trees, their footfalls fading until the jungle swallowed them completely. Only when they were gone did Elara release the breath she'd been holding. Matteo gave her a slow nod. You did well. They retraced their path away from the gorge, keeping to the high ground. The oppressive hum in the air had faded, but the memory of it, and the feeling it carried, lingered. Days later, back in Guatemala City, Elara found herself staring at the children's book on the small table in her hotel room. She had carried it across the jungle and back, and now it sat there innocuous as ever, its watercolor cover betraying nothing of the secrets inside. The code was still hers, the coordinates, the warnings, the truths hidden in the glyphs, all locked in her notebook. She could tell the world, but she wouldn't. Not yet. Instead, she opened her notebook and, in the margin beside the final translation, wrote a single line, "Not ready." Weeks later, back in the library basement, she slipped the book into a different shelf, one she knew no one visited. Her fingers lingered on the spine. The pyramid would remain hidden, for now. The storm, whatever it was, would come, whether she spoke or stayed silent. But if it came, she wanted to be ready. She walked up the basement steps into the light, her mind already turning over what the next set of glyphs might mean. The world above her was unchanged. The quiet shuffle of readers, the hum of the air conditioner, the familiar scent of old paper. But she knew the truth. The most dangerous treasures weren't gold or jewels. They were knowledge. And knowledge, once found, could never be buried again. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.